The storm that swallowed Hayes Morrison's life didn't arrive with thunder. It came quietly, through a man's lies, a woman's ambition, and a city that fed on secrets. One airport confrontation shattered a decade of silence, dragging him into a world built on political rot and private vendettas. And long before he realized it, every step he took was already scripted by someone else. He thought he was fighting to clear his name. In truth, he was walking straight into someone's revenge. If you've ever felt cornered by people who smile while burying you alive, stay with me. You'll understand every heartbeat of this story. The first blow didn't land on Hayes Morrison's body. It landed on his name. It came the moment he stepped into the airport, believing he was finally done running, finally done explaining himself to people who never cared to understand him. The cold air rushed in through the sliding doors as if greeting him with a slap, and before he could steady his breathing, the past he thought he had outrun roared back, loud, violent, and cruelly familiar. All he wanted was a quiet return, a simple step into a life that had already taken too much from him. But fate wasn't done. Fate wanted a scene. Fate wanted witnesses. And fate chose the worst possible moment to remind Hayes that his peace was never really his. A single shove sent him stumbling. Not enough to injure him, just enough to humiliate him. Cameras whipped around. Strangers stared. And a voice dripping with rehearsed outrage filled the space. She acted as though Hayes was some threat, some monster who had lunged at her without warning. The performance was flawless, designed to provoke, to corner him into a reaction that would feed the narrative she wanted. He could almost feel the lies forming in the air before she even spoke them. Hayes didn't lift a hand, didn't raise his voice. But in a world where truth bent under the weight of accusation, restraint meant nothing. Airport security moved fast, far faster than reason. Hands grabbed his arms, pushing him down, treating him like a problem they had been waiting to solve. Even then, Hayes held back. He'd learned long ago that fighting only fed the wolves. And today, they were starving. When Detective Timothy Snow appeared, he didn't bother hiding his disappointment. Snow wasn't the kind of man who jumped to conclusions, but he also wasn't the type to ignore disaster unfolding at his feet. His posture alone made it clear Hayes had stepped into something bigger than a simple confrontation. Something planned. Something personal. Snow's questions came sharp. Hayes' answers came calm. But the tension between them was a battle neither wanted to acknowledge. Snow wasn't his enemy, but Snow also wasn't here by chance. The woman who shoved Hayes kept her distance now, tearful, fragile, shaking like she had survived an attack that never happened. Her trembling voice trembled just enough to melt the hearts of anyone watching. Every syllable was a dagger aimed at Hayes' throat. And Hayes saw it, the glint of triumph hiding behind her fear. She knew exactly what she was doing. By the time Snow walked him outside, the sky seemed heavier, darker, mocking him with its indifference. Snow kept staring at him like there was something he wasn't saying, something building behind his eyes. But Hayes said nothing, because he knew Snow was right. And that truth stung more than the shove, the accusations, or the crowd's judgment. Hayes wasn't a criminal, but he was a target. He'd been one for a long time. At Snow's car, the detective paused. Hayes could tell he was deciding whether to speak as a professional or as a man who actually knew him. For a moment, Snow's voice softened, not with sympathy, but with warning. He told Hayes this wasn't random. Someone wanted him rattled. Someone wanted him watched. Hayes didn't need the warning. He already knew. When they reached the precinct, the hostility inside felt deliberate, like word had spread ahead of them. Whispers followed Hayes through the hallway. People who had never met him judged him like they'd known him for years. And Hayes felt the familiar burn rising in his chest, the one he had spent years burying. His attorney arrived with fury in her stride, frustrated with him, furious at the world, and terrified she wouldn't be able to pull him out of this one. The pressure was visible on her face, the kind that comes from knowing you're defending a man whose truth keeps getting strangled by other people's motives. She spoke fast, too fast. Lawsuits, damages, upticks. The threat of a scandal that could explode far beyond this small incident. Hayes listened in silence because there was nothing left to defend. Every word she said only confirmed what he already sensed. The woman who shoved him hadn't acted alone. Someone wanted to drag him back into the shadows he fought so hard to escape. The meeting ended with more questions than answers. But the biggest question wasn't who set him up. It was why now. He had barely stepped outside the precinct when the city assaulted him with its noise again. Cars, voices, the hum of life that didn't care whether he bled. Snow lingered near him, not as law enforcement, but as someone who recognized the look in Hayes' eyes, the look of man edging dangerously close to losing everything again. Snow asked one simple question, one that pierced deeper than any accusation. What aren't you telling me? Hayes had 1,000 answers, none of them safe, so he said nothing, because the truth was a weapon, and right now, he didn't know who would twist the blade first. But as he walked away, the question echoed in his mind, dragging with it the cold realization that frightened him more than anything else that had happened that day. If this was only the beginning, what kind of storm was waiting on the other end? Hayes had always believed that silence protected him, that if he stayed low, stayed calm, stayed invisible, the world would eventually forget his name. But the world wasn't forgetting. Someone was making sure of that. Every step he took after the airport felt heavier, as if invisible hands were gripping the edges of his life, pulling him into a game he never agreed to play. His attorney's voice kept echoing in his head long after she left him standing in the cold hallway of the precinct. She wasn't just angry, she was afraid. People like her didn't fear small mistakes or minor scandals. They feared something engineered, something with weight behind it, something political. And Hayes had spent enough years navigating other people's agendas to recognize when he was being maneuvered like a pawn. The summons came the next morning, elegantly printed, sealed, and hand-delivered like an invitation to a royal event. But the content was anything but celebratory. Diana Gregor, the polished force of nature behind more than half the city's political machinery, wanted to meet him. Not requested, not invited, wanted. And people who wanted something from Hayes rarely left him better for it. Her office sat at the top of a building too clean, too perfect, too staged for reality. The kind of place where secrets didn't hide. They were displayed like trophies. Hayes could feel the air sharpen the moment he stepped inside. Assistants stared at him with cold curiosity, whispering behind manicured hands as though examining a specimen. When Diana finally emerged, every inch of her radiated a power so smooth it felt weaponized. Her smile was warm, but not human. It was a kind of smile crafted for cameras, not for comfort. She greeted him like they were old friends. Hayes didn't return the sentiment. Her tone was light, playful, dripping with the kind of confidence that comes from knowing she controlled the board. She spoke of opportunity, public image, redemption, all the things Hayes no longer trusted. And then she slid the true purpose across the table, an impeccably prepared lawsuit threat, dressed up like friendly advice. The message was simple: play along or get crushed. Diana offered him an out, but it was coated in poison. Attend her Christmas event, her harmless little gathering, as she described it. Smile, shake hands, let her show the world she could tame the man the media loved to drag through the mud. In exchange, she'd make the airport incident disappear. Hayes didn't answer right away. He stared at the papers, reading between every line, every shadow. This wasn't generosity. This was leverage. This was control. This was a leash disguised as a lifeline. He asked her what she truly wanted. Her smile widened. Only one word left her lips: cooperation. The kind of cooperation that doesn't end once the cameras stop flashing. Hayes walked out without accepting. But he didn't refuse either. And people like Diana Grigor thrived in that gray space, knowing hesitation wasn't resistance. It was permission. Snow was waiting for him outside the building. Hayes didn't know whether to be grateful or uneasy. The detective's face revealed nothing, but his presence alone told Hayes one truth. Snow didn't buy the idea that this was just an airport misunderstanding. He knew Hayes was in deeper waters. Snow asked him again, what did Diana want? Hayes didn't lie, but he didn't speak either, because saying Diana's name out loud felt like acknowledging the start of something irreversible. That night, Hayes tried to sleep, but the silence in his apartment felt wrong, like the walls were listening. His phone kept lighting up. Missed calls, persistent reminders, messages from people who never contacted him unless something was wrong. Rumors were spreading, stories morphing. The airport incident was crawling across the city like a stain, and Hayes felt it. The shift, the tightening, the pressure that came before a trap snapped shut. The next morning, an envelope was shoved under his door. No return address. No signature. Inside was one item. A glossy invitation card. Diana Gregor's Christmas Gala. Attendance mandatory. The word mandatory was handwritten. In red ink. Hayes felt his jaw tighten as he held it. His attorney's warning returned in full force. Someone wanted him visible. Standing under bright lights, forced into a space where every smile could be a lie and every handshake a threat. But beneath all the glitter and celebration, Hayes knew whose game he was now trapped in. Diana wasn't hosting a party. She was hosting a stage. And Hayes was the unwilling centerpiece. Snow visited again that afternoon, frustration visible now. The detective wasn't angry at Hayes. He was angry at the invisible forces circling him. Forces Snow couldn't arrest, couldn't interrogate, couldn't drag into an interrogation room. Snow admitted something then, something rare. He told Hayes that people like Diana didn't make moves without a motive. Whatever she wanted from him, it wouldn't end at a gala. This was step one in a larger design. Hayes asked him what that design could be. Snow didn't answer, because Snow didn't know. But he feared it, and fear from a man like Snow meant Hayes was standing in the center of a storm crafted with precision, built piece by piece, long before he ever stepped into that airport. As Hayes stared again at the red ink forcing him to attend, a question took shape in the back of his mind. A question he didn't know how to answer. If this was only her opening move, what would Diana Gregor take from him next? The days leading up to Diana Gregor's Christmas Gala felt like a tightening vice around Hayes' chest, slow, deliberate, and merciless. Every morning brought a new reminder that he was no longer steering his own life. Someone else was driving, and Hayes was trapped in the passenger seat with no brakes. The city buzzed with whispers surrounding him. People he had known for years looked at him differently now, like he was a ticking bomb they didn't want to stand too close to. His reputation, already fragile from years of misunderstanding and political sabotage, was now being reshaped by unseen hands. Hayes could feel it happening in real time, a subtle but powerful rewriting of who he was. And at the center of it all stood Diana Gregor, smiling behind her walls of influence. Detective Snow visited him one last time before the gala. This time, the detective didn't carry the usual weight of procedure or authority. He carried concern, raw, unfiltered, and rare for a man who had seen too much to be easily shaken. Snow sat across from Hayes, studying him like he was trying to solve a crime that hadn't happened yet. He told Hayes something he had been reluctant to admit earlier. The airport incident wasn't a spontaneous attack, and it wasn't orchestrated by an angry stranger. It was part of a chain reaction, one that began long before Hayes ever booked his flight. He revealed that Diana Gregor had been digging into Hayes' past for months. Quiet inquiries, subtle pressure, questions disguised as political curiosity. Snow had seen these patterns before, when someone was building a case, not legally, but socially, shaping public opinion like clay. Hayes didn't react at first. He didn't need more proof. His instinct had been screaming the same truth from the moment Diana slid those papers across her desk. But Snow wasn't finished. The detective leaned forward, lowering his voice as though the walls could betray them. He told Hayes that people within Diana's circle had been in contact with a woman who accused him at the airport. Phone records, appointments, payments that didn't align. Nothing concrete enough to arrest anyone, but enough to confirm a reality Hayes had been fearing. He wasn't caught in an accident. He was caught in a plan, a precise one that required him to be destabilized, isolated, and publicly corrected under Diana's guidance. Hayes finally asked the question he had been avoiding. Why me? Snow didn't answer right away. He stood, paced, wrestled with thought he didn't want to say aloud. And then he gave Hayes the truth in its purest, coldest form. Because Hayes wasn't a threat to Diana's power. He was a tool, a symbol, a story she could shape to strengthen her image, someone she could fix, elevate, or destroy depending on what her campaign needed. Hayes wasn't a man to her. He was a resource, a prop, a living narrative, and she owned the stage. That truth settled into Hayes' stomach like ice. Because deep down, he already knew. But hearing it aloud, hearing Snow confirm it, made it real in a way that left him unable to breathe for a moment. Snow placed a hand on his shoulder, an unspoken gesture of solidarity. But solidarity from a detective couldn't protect Hayes from someone who played politics like war. Diana had no laws restricting her ambition, no boundaries she respected. She didn't break rules, she rewrote them. When the night of the gala arrived, the air itself felt hostile. The building shimmered with holiday lights, music, and laughter, but beneath the beauty lurked something corrosive. Hayes felt like he was walking into a velvet-lined trap, a place where the cage was so luxurious you almost forgot it was closing around you. Inside, dozens of powerful faces turned toward him. Some curious, some amused, some silently judgmental. And Diana, wearing a smile polished enough to cut glass, approached him with open arms. She acted delighted, honored, warm. Hayes recognized the performance instantly. She didn't want him here as a guest. She wanted him here as evidence that she controlled him, that she could summon him with a single invitation, and he would come. She guided him through the room like an exhibit at an auction, introducing him to donors, officials, allies. He watched her carefully as she spoke about him, not to him, using soft phrases like misunderstood, complicated, trying his best. Each word tasted like poison dipped in sugar. Every time she touched his arm or leaned in with full affection, Hayes felt the weight of the world pressing down harder. He saw it now, clearer than ever. This wasn't about the airport, or the press, or the lawsuit. This was about control. About showing everyone in that room that Diana Gregor could take a broken man and fix him publicly, mold him, display him, and if she wished, destroy him with one speech, one leaked rumor, one whisper. Hayes didn't drink, didn't eat, didn't smile. He stood in the middle of a glittering battlefield and felt the truth burn through him. He was surrounded by orchestrators, architects of ruin, people who built their victories from the bones of others. And Diana was their queen. Snow arrived late, scanning the room with a veteran's caution. When his eyes found Hayes, something tightened in his expression, recognition of a man trapped in the center of a web spun with threads too fine to see but too strong to break. When the choir began singing and the cameras turned toward the stage, Diana placed a hand on Hayes' back and guided him forward, as though she owned him, as though he existed because she permitted it. And Hayes finally understood what this moment truly was. Not a party, not a celebration, not an apology tour. It was the unveiling of his new role in Diana's empire, a role he never wanted, one he would be expected to perform, or pay the consequences. He looked out at the sea of faces waiting for her speech and felt a single thought settle heavy in his chest, darker and more dangerous than anything he had faced yet. If this was how far she went just to pull him onto her stage, how much farther would she go to keep him there? If you want, I can now begin chapter 4, if you want to extend the story, or we can proceed to final polish, expansion, or continuation exactly as you desire. Just tell me, continue or stop. The applause from Diana's stage still echoed in Hayes' ears long after the event was over. He walked down the steps with the stiff movement of a man carrying invisible chains, each clink muffled beneath the polite laughter and clinking glasses of the gala. He couldn't remember the last time a room full of people had felt so silent, despite the noise. Or maybe the silence wasn't around him at all. Maybe it was inside him. The cold night outside slapped his senses awake. For a moment, he stood at the edge of the building, breathing in air that didn't smell like perfume, politics, or polished deceit. Snow flurried down around him, the soft kind that falls without warning and melts the second it touches the ground. Funny, he thought. Even the weather knew how to vanish. Snow, Detective Snow, watched him from a distance, hands buried in his coat pockets, eyes scanning the sidewalk for threats that weren't visible. Hayes knew why the detective lingered. Some traps didn't spring at the beginning. They waited until the prey thought it was safe. Hayes didn't feel safe. Not here. Not anywhere. Snow approached, footsteps crunching lightly. You handled yourself, he said quietly, as if the building behind them had ears. But it's not over. Hayes let out a breath that wasn't quite a laugh. When is it ever over? Snow didn't answer because they both knew the truth. People like Diana Gregor never ended anything. They simply paused it when it no longer served their purpose. Hayes wasn't out of danger. He was simply between battles. He glanced back at the glowing windows of the gala, the silhouettes of powerful people dancing behind tinted glass. They looked like shadows celebrating their victories. Diana moved among them like an empress surveying her kingdom, every gesture smooth, every conversation purposeful. Hayes wondered if there had ever been a version of his life where he didn't end up inside someone else's plans. If there had ever been a moment where he made a choice that wasn't quietly rewritten by another person's agenda. He had spent so long fighting the story others told about him that he had forgotten what it meant to have one of his own. Snow kicked lightly at the snow-covered curb. "She won tonight," he murmured. "I know. But she didn't finish you." Hayes didn't respond. The words felt like comfort, but they tasted like denial. He wasn't finished tonight because Diana didn't want him finished. She wanted him compliant, predictable, useful. He started walking, slow and aimless, as if the cold might answer questions his mind couldn't. Snow kept pace beside him, a silent shadow. Streetlights painted long stretches of empty pavement ahead, but no matter how far Hayes walked, the feeling followed him, the sensation of being watched, weighed, measured. They reached an intersection. Snow stopped. Hayes didn't. "Be careful," Snow called out. Hayes paused at the sound of genuine concern. He turned just enough to see the detective's expression illuminated by the glow of the street lamp. It wasn't the look of a man closing a case. It was the look of someone who knew the case was just beginning. "I don't know what Diana wants next," Snow said, "but I do know she's not done with you." Hayes nodded, then continued down the street alone. The city was quieter now, but not peaceful. Quiet in the way a forest becomes silent when a predator is near. Hayes understood the difference. Every step took him farther from the glittering building behind him. Yet every thought pulled him back into it, to the moment Diana placed a hand on his back, guiding him onto the stage like a prized animal. The cameras flashed, capturing an image he knew she would weaponize. She didn't need to destroy him. She just needed to own him. Hayes stopped walking. Snowflakes collected on his hair and shoulders, melting slowly as if unsure whether they should stay. He looked up at the empty sky. Tonight had offered him no answers, only confirmation of a truth he had spent years refusing. He wasn't being punished for his mistakes. He was being sculpted for someone else's victory. The airport incident, the lawsuit threat, the mandatory gala, none of it was chaos. It was choreography. Diana Gregor had crafted a problem, then positioned herself as a solution, and Hayes had been forced to play the role written for him. He clenched his fists inside his pockets, but it wasn't anger that shook through him. It was clarity, the kind that arrived slowly, quietly, like dawn creeping under a doorframe. People didn't orchestrate someone's downfall unless they feared what he might become. And Diana feared something in him. That thought unsettled him more than the trap itself. He didn't know what she saw. He didn't know why he mattered at all in her vast network of ambition. But he knew one thing for certain. You don't invest as much effort breaking a man unless you believe he could one day stand in your way. Hayes exhaled, watching his breath swell upward like a ghost leaving his body. He wasn't safe. He wasn't free. And he wasn't finished. But for the first time, he understood the landscape of his own suffering. The architects of his ruin weren't invisible anymore. They had names, faces, ambitions, and if they wanted to write him into their story. They have forgotten one truth about stories. Some characters don't stay victims. Some become the storm. Hayes turned, walking into the darkness, not running, not escaping, just moving forward with a new awareness. The path ahead was uncertain, dangerous, poisoned by politics and power. But now he finally knew the question that would guide him through whatever came next. If Diana Gregor had built a role for him, what would happen when he stopped playing it?